The Enlightenment, an age when thinkers dared to question everything. After centuries of religious authority, humanity began to believe that truth could be discovered, not revealed. Fueled by the printing press, by Galileo's telescope, and by the courage to doubt, reason became the new faith. This is where our story continues, from devotion to discovery, from obedience to thought. The Age of Enlightenment, when reason challenged faith, and the modern world was born. Chapter 1. Breaking the Chains. The light of reason did not appear in an instant. It flickered to life slowly, born out of centuries of curiosity and courage. The Middle Ages had given Europe a rigid order. The church guarded knowledge, kings ruled by divine right, and truth flowed only from Scripture. But by the 15th century, the cracks had begun to show. It started with ink. In 1440, a German metalsmith named Johannes Gutenberg built a press that could multiply words faster than any monk's hand. His invention didn't just copy texts, it copied power. For the first time, knowledge could travel freely, unbound from monastery walls. Ideas that once whispered among scholars now shouted from pages, and once an idea could spread, it could no longer be contained. The printing press didn't just make books, it made rebellion. Through it came Erasmus, who dared to criticize corruption within the church while still clinging to faith. Through it came Luther, whose 95 Theses questioned the very sale of salvation. And through it came humanists, thinkers who believed that man, not merely heaven, was the measure of all things. Humanism didn't destroy faith, it humanized it. It reminded people that reason and conscience were also divine gifts. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci sketched anatomy with reverence. Astronomers charted the heavens as a form of worship. Yet beneath this flourishing, something radical was awakening. The belief that truth could be discovered, not decreed. Renaissance scholars rediscovered Plato, Aristotle, and Epicurus. The ancient world, once viewed as pagan, became a partner in thought. Greek rationalism and Christian doctrine began to collide, and in that collision, sparks of enlightenment were born. By the 1500s, Europe's faith in authority was weakening. The Church's grip on knowledge, once absolute, faced a growing challenge from curiosity itself. Sailors were mapping new worlds that Scripture had never mentioned. Scientists were finding order in nature without invoking miracles. The compass, the telescope, the microscope. Each invention whispered the same subversive idea. Perhaps divine mystery could be measured, but questioning the truth had its price. The Inquisition's flames still burned for heretics. Philosophers had to hide their doubts behind coded words. Yet even fear couldn't silence the new hunger, a yearning for understanding grounded in evidence, not edict. What began as curiosity was turning into courage, the courage to question the unquestionable. The Renaissance was the bridge, its feet planted in faith, its eyes fixed on discovery. It celebrated God's creation through art and science, but it also celebrated the human mind as a reflection of that creation. And that was dangerous, because if reason was divine, then reason could also challenge divinity. Soon, one man would take that challenge to the heavens themselves. With a telescope pointed at the stars, he would turn curiosity into confrontation and faith into fury. And so the age of questioning moved from parchment to sky. From the quiet pages of humanist scholars to the bold lens of one scientist who dared to look where the church had forbidden. Galileo Galilei. Chapter 2. Galileo's Shadow. The heavens had always belonged to God. For centuries they were his perfect realm, untouched, unchanging, flawless in their divine order. The stars were lamps lit by the Creator, the planets, wheels in his celestial clock. And Earth, so everyone believed, was the center of it all, the stage upon which his creation unfolded. But then came a man with a telescope. In 1609, Galileo Galilei, an Italian mathematician from Pisa, turned a simple tube of glass toward the night sky, and what he saw shattered that heavenly perfection. The moon was not smooth, but scarred and mountainous. The planet Jupiter had moons of its own, orbiting not the Earth but another world entirely. And Venus, that bright morning star, showed phases like the moon, proof that it circled the sun. With every new discovery, the universe grew bigger, and humanity smaller. Galileo's telescope turned the cosmos from scripture into science. He was not the first to imagine a sun-centered universe. Copernicus had quietly suggested it nearly a century earlier. But Galileo proved it. He saw it with his own eyes, and he told the world what he saw. At first, the church admired him. His discoveries were useful, even exciting. But admiration turned to suspicion when Galileo began to write not only as a scientist, but as a philosopher, questioning not just what the heavens were, but who had the right to interpret them. In 1615, he wrote that the Bible teaches how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. It was a bold statement, and a dangerous one, because it suggested that nature, not scripture, was the ultimate authority on truth. The church saw the danger. If scripture could be wrong about the cosmos, what else could it be wrong about? One telescope had aimed at the stars and struck the foundations of faith. One telescope had aimed at the stars and struck the foundations of faith. One telescope had aimed at the stars and struck the foundations of faith. In 1632, Galileo published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, a masterpiece disguised as conversation. It compared the old Earth-centered model with the new Sun-centered one. But within its witty dialogue, the Church recognized a clear target. The old model's defender, Simplicio, seemed a thinly veiled caricature of the Pope himself. That was enough. Galileo was summoned to Rome. The trial was not about planets or physics. It was about power. Standing before the Inquisition, Galileo faced not scientific criticism, but theological judgment. The question was not whether his evidence was correct, it was whether he dared to claim that observation could outrank revelation. He was forced to kneel, to recant, to declare that the earth did not move. But as legend tells it, when he rose, he whispered, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. Whether he said the words or not, they captured the spirit of the age, reason whispering defiance beneath the weight of faith. Galileo spent the rest of his life under house arrest, blind, frail, yet unbroken. His discoveries spread across Europe like forbidden fruit, eaten eagerly by thinkers hungry for knowledge. The church had silenced one man, but it could not silence an idea, because Galileo had done more than look through a telescope. He had shown that the universe could be understood by human reason alone, that truth could be tested, not just taught, that nature itself was a book, written not in parables, but in the language of mathematics. The stars no longer sang of heaven. They spoke of law, order, and reason. To the faithful, it was heresy. To philosophers, it was revelation. Galileo's trial became a symbol not of defeat, but of awakening. It revealed the fragile balance between discovery and doctrine. Chapter 3. The Age of Reason. Galileo's telescope had opened the sky. But what it truly revealed was the power of the mind, the quiet, relentless force of human reason. And as the 17th century gave way to the 18th, that force would no longer hide behind apology or caution. It would march into the world proudly, calling itself the Enlightenment. Europe was changing. Printing presses hummed in every city. Ideas crossed borders faster than armies. Coffee houses filled with merchants, writers, and philosophers who debated everything from politics to the purpose of the soul. The air buzzed with conversation, with daring questions once thought forbidden. The age of faith had built cathedrals, now the age of reason was building minds. Among the first voices to rise above the noise was John Locke, an English philosopher who declared that the human mind is born a blank slate, tabula rasa. No one, he said, is born with divine truth imprinted on their soul. Knowledge comes through experience, through observation. For centuries, the Church had claimed to be the guardian of truth. Locke placed that power back into human hands. His philosophy became the foundation of modern thought, and eventually modern democracy. If Locke gave reason its foundation, Voltaire gave it its voice. Sharp, witty, and fearless, Voltaire used satire as his weapon and reason as his shield. He mocked superstition, condemned fanaticism, and demanded freedom of speech, even for those who disagreed with him. "Those who can make you believe absurdities," he wrote, "can make you commit atrocities." To Voltaire, blind faith was dangerous. But reason was liberation. Words replaced swords, and pamphlets became more powerful than pulpits. In Paris, Denis Diderot took Voltaire's ideas and gave them structure. He gathered writers, scientists, and philosophers from across Europe to create the Encyclopédie, a vast collection of human knowledge. It was more than a book. It was a declaration of independence for the mind. The Church tried to ban it. Monarchs called it heresy, but still it spread. For the first time, knowledge belonged not to priests or kings, but to anyone who could read. Across the English Channel, David Hume pushed the boundaries even further. Where others sought to reconcile reason and faith, Hume dismantled the very foundation of belief. He asked, "Can we truly know anything beyond our perceptions? Are miracles credible when human experience has never confirmed one?" His arguments were not angry, they were surgical, and their implication was terrifying. If reason ruled supreme, then perhaps faith was not just outdated, it was unnecessary. And yet, even as these thinkers challenged religion, many of them still searched for God. Not the God of miracles or dogma, but a rational creator, a clockmaker who set the universe in motion and stepped back. This belief became known as deism. Deists saw God not in Scripture, but in the laws of nature. The Creator's miracles were not sudden acts. They were the predictable patterns of gravity, light, and life itself. It was a comforting compromise. Reason without atheism, faith without superstition. But beneath its calm surface, the Enlightenment carried a quiet revolution. If God no longer intervened, then the world was left to human hands. And humanity, for the first time, began to believe it could shape its own destiny. The universe had order, but did it still have meaning? The Enlightenment spread like wildfire, from salons in Paris to universities in Edinburgh, from the royal courts of Europe to the taverns of the New World. Kings began to fear it. Churches tried to silence it, but even they couldn't ignore its logic. Everywhere, people were asking the same questions. What gives rulers their authority? Who decides what is true? And if reason is universal, then why should one man command another? The Age of Reason was not only a battle of ideas, it was a revolution of identity. It redefined what it meant to be human. Faith had once taught that man had fallen, dependent on grace. Reason now insisted that man was capable, responsible, free. This was a world in transition, its feet in the old order, its mind in the new. And as philosophers dissected morality and religion, scientists began to uncover the machinery of the universe itself. Because if reason could explain the human mind, perhaps it could also explain the cosmos. And one man would show the world that the heavens, too, obeyed not miracles, but law. The philosophers had declared that reason was the highest power. Now a scientist would prove it, with mathematics so perfect it seemed divine. His name was Isaac Newton, and his universe would change everything. Chapter 4. Newton and the Machine. The philosophers had dreamed of a world guided by reason, but one man would give that dream a shape so precise, so elegant, that it would become the new image of creation itself. His name was Isaac Newton, and his universe was a machine. He was a man of paradox, part mathematician, part mystic, a scientist who studied both gravity and God. Born in 1643, the year Galileo died, Newton inherited a world torn between faith and knowledge, and through the silence of his study in Cambridge, he sought to unite them. In 1687, he published a book that would change history, Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. It was not just a scientific work, it was a revelation written in numbers. Where others saw miracles, Newton saw laws. In its pages, he revealed that every object in the universe, from an apple falling from a tree to the planets circling the sun, obeys the same mathematical rules. The heavens and the earth, once thought separate realms, were bound by a single invisible force, gravity. The cosmos, once guided by divine will, now moved by precise, measurable law. For many, this was not the death of God, but his ultimate proof. If the universe operated with such perfect order, then surely it had been designed by a perfect mind. Newton himself believed that the beauty of his equations reflected divine intelligence, that the laws of nature were the handwriting of the Creator. He once wrote, "This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being." To Newton, science did not replace God, it revealed him. But to the generations that followed, something else began to emerge. As philosophers and scientists built upon Newton's work, a new vision took hold: the clockwork universe, a creation so flawless that it no longer needed its creator. God became the cosmic engineer. He had wound up the gears, set them spinning, and stepped away. The deist's God, the distant watchmaker, was born. The miracle was no longer in the act of creation, but in the mechanism that kept it running without intervention. This vision captivated the Enlightenment. For centuries, miracles had been proof of God's power. Now they were seen as flaws in his design. A perfect God, reasoned the philosophers, would not need to break his own laws, and so the universe became self-sufficient, a vast machine ticking with perfect rhythm, indifferent to prayer or sin, guided only by logic. It was a triumph for science and a quiet tragedy for faith. Because if everything could be explained by natural law, what was left for the supernatural? If every movement of the stars, every beat of the heart, every breath we take followed the same mathematical order, was there any room left for mystery? The Church watched uneasily as Newton's discoveries spread. Ironically, many clergymen first embraced them, believing that mechanical order was proof of divine genius. But as reason's influence grew, the balance began to tilt. What had begun as faith through science soon became faith in science. Humanity had learned the rules of creation and started to believe it could play the role of creator. Newton himself would have resisted that idea. He spent more time writing about theology and alchemy than physics, searching for divine secrets hidden in scripture and nature alike. To him, the laws of the cosmos were sacred, but they were only half the story. The other half, the soul, the purpose, the mystery, still belong to God. But reason, once unleashed, has a life of its own. By the 18th century, the Newtonian model had become more than science. It had become philosophy. The universe was now a grand, predictable clock, and humanity, instead of seeking salvation, sought understanding. The shift was subtle, but seismic. Where faith once saw miracles, reason saw mechanics. Where scripture once offered certainty, mathematics offered proof. And where priests once interpreted the heavens, now scientists did. The language of creation had changed, from sacred text to formula. Heaven had not vanished, it had been rewritten in numbers. This transformation reached far beyond physics. It seeped into politics, economics, even morality. If the universe ran on natural law, perhaps society did too. Thinkers like Adam Smith applied Newton's logic to human behavior, describing the invisible hand that guided markets. Others saw in nature's order the foundation for human rights, that liberty and reason were as natural as gravity itself. The machine had become a metaphor for everything, for nations, for minds, for the human body. And in this vast system of order, people began to wonder, was the soul just another cog? Faith adapted where it could. Natural theology emerged, arguing that studying the world scientifically was a form of worship, that every law discovered by reason was a reflection of divine intelligence. But even as some reconciled, others recoiled. They feared that God was being replaced by equations, that morality would fade in a world ruled by mechanics. And yet, despite the tension, something miraculous did happen, not divine, but human. The Newtonian vision united the cosmos. It gave humanity a framework, a shared language to explore creation without fear. It was the foundation of the Enlightenment's boldest promise, that through reason, humanity could not only understand the world, but improve it. Newton had sought the mind of God through the laws of nature, but his followers found instead the power of their own minds. And from that power came a confidence that would reshape the world, not only in laboratories but in revolutions. Because once people realized that nature could be governed by reason, they began to ask a more dangerous question. Could society be governed the same way? The Enlightenment had conquered the heavens. Now it would turn its gaze back to earth, to kings, to churches, to power itself. Faith was about to stand trial again, this time not before scientists, but before the people. Chapter 6. Seeds of Revolution. Ideas are powerful things. They begin as whispers in the minds of thinkers, scribbled in books, debated in cafes. But when the right spark meets the right moment, ideas can move armies, topple empires, and rewrite the moral fabric of the world. By the late 18th century, Enlightenment thought had reached that critical mass. The language of reason had escaped the libraries and salons and entered the streets. And everywhere, the old order began to tremble. For centuries, kings had ruled by divine right. Priests had spoken for God. The poor had been told that their suffering was part of heaven's plan. But now, philosophers were asking questions that made obedience sound like ignorance. If every human being was capable of reason, then what made one man fit to rule another? If natural law governed the universe, could it not also govern society? Reason had mapped the stars. Now it turned its gaze to power. In England, John Locke's words became the first tremors of revolution. He declared that governments exist not by divine command, but by the consent of the governed. That liberty was a natural right, not a royal gift. That people had the power to overthrow any ruler who betrayed their trust. These were not just political theories. They were heresies against centuries of theology. Because to challenge a king was, in the eyes of the church, to challenge God himself. But the tide could not be stopped. In France, Montesquieu wrote of separating powers to protect liberty. In America, Thomas Jefferson, inspired by Locke, would write that all men are created equal and endowed not by kings or clergy, but by their Creator, with unalienable rights. When Jefferson's pen struck parchment in 1776, the Enlightenment's ideas became action. The American Revolution was not only a war for independence, it was a declaration that reason could replace revelation as the foundation of government. No longer would authority descend from heaven. It would rise from the people. To the old world, this was blasphemy in motion. A republic born not of divine will, but of human reason. A nation founded on liberty, not faith. And yet it worked. Across the Atlantic, others were watching and waiting. In France, a nation long suffocated under the twin weight of monarchy and the church, the ideas of liberty and equality began to boil. The philosophers had sowed the seeds. The people would reap the storm. Paris, 1789. The streets were alive with hunger, hope, and fury. The French Revolution began not in the name of God, but in the name of reason itself. The cry was no longer glory to the king, but liberty, equality, fraternity. Churches were stripped of power, their lands seized by the state. The calendar was remade, erasing Christian holy days. Even the months were renamed, an attempt to start time itself anew. In the grand cathedral of Notre Dame, the altar of God was replaced with an altar to reason. It was a symbolic gesture and a warning. The same Enlightenment ideals that had promised freedom could, when unrestrained, devour the very spirit they sought to liberate. The torch of reason could illuminate or burn. As the guillotine rose and fell, the world watched in awe and horror. The old order was dead, but so was mercy. The dream of a rational society had descended into chaos. Even Voltaire's ghost might have shuddered. Yet beneath the blood and fervor, something irreversible had happened. The divine right of kings was gone. The church's monopoly on truth was broken, and the idea that human reason could shape a just society had taken root forever. Across Europe, monarchs and clergy scrambled to contain the contagion. Pamphlets and preachers warned that without faith, civilization itself would collapse. But for the new generation, faith had already changed form. It was no longer blind devotion to a church. It was belief in progress, in liberty, in the moral law written not on tablets of stone, but in the human heart. The Enlightenment had birthed a new kind of spirituality, the faith in reason itself. The revolutionaries saw their struggle as holy in its own way, a crusade for truth, freedom, and human dignity. And like all crusades, it demanded sacrifice. Some philosophers recoiled at what their ideas had unleashed. Rousseau's vision of a virtuous republic had curdled into fanaticism. The dreamers who had written of equality watched their words become instruments of terror. Still, the world could not return to what it had been. The revolutions had rewritten the social contract. The church would remain, but never again would it stand unchallenged. Monarchs would reign, but never again as gods. The Enlightenment had lit a flame that no empire could extinguish, the conviction that humanity could govern itself, not by divine revelation, but by reasoned principle. From America's Declaration to France's Constitution, from the salons of Europe to the streets of Haiti and Latin America, the cry echoed, "Knowledge is power, liberty is sacred, and truth belongs to all." But as the dust of revolution settled, a question lingered, one that no philosopher could easily answer. If reason could build nations, could it also guide hearts? If morality was no longer divine, what would prevent progress from becoming tyranny? The Enlightenment had dethroned kings and disarmed priests, but it had not yet solved the oldest riddle of all: how to unite truth and virtue, freedom and faith. The world has won its freedom, but not its peace. By the dawn of the 19th century, Europe was both liberated and lost. The power of faith had faded, but so too had the moral certainty it provided. Factories replaced monasteries, science replaced scripture. But in the noise of progress, a quiet emptiness began to grow. The human mind had conquered the heavens, but the human heart still longed for meaning. The Enlightenment had taught the world how to think, but not always why. That tension would not disappear. It would evolve, resurfacing in new forms, in nationalism, in romanticism, in the desperate search for moral direction amid the triumph of knowledge. And soon, a new kind of thinker would arise, one who looked not to the heavens, but to the natural world, searching for humanity's place within it. His ideas would ignite the next great chapter in the story of faith and reason. His name was Charles Darwin. The Enlightenment had torn down the walls of old belief. Now the 19th century stood at the crossroads between faith rediscovered and faith redefined. The struggle was far from over. It was merely entering a new evolution. Chapter 7. The Fragile Balance. The Enlightenment had given humanity freedom. Freedom from kings, from superstition, from the unquestioned authority of the church. But freedom, like fire, is hard to control. When the smoke of revolution cleared, the world stood blinking in the new light of reason, and found itself asking what came next. The altars had been torn down, the crowns cast aside, but in their place, something was missing. Reason had explained the world, but not the human heart. It could measure the stars, calculate the motion of planets, define the laws of gravity, but it could not explain why we feel awe beneath the night sky, or why we long for purpose in the vast silence of the universe. Humanity has learned how the world works, but forgotten why it matters. The 19th century dawned with both pride and unease. The Enlightenment's legacy, freedom of thought, scientific progress, political rights, was undeniable. But beneath the triumph, a question lingered like an echo. If God was no longer at the center of the universe, what was? Artists, poets, and philosophers began to rebel, not against reason, but against its coldness. This reaction became known as Romanticism, a movement that sought to restore wonder, emotion, and faith to a world that reason had made mechanical. Where the Enlightenment saw logic, the Romantics saw mystery. Where philosophers spoke of universal laws, poets spoke of the soul. They believed that not everything true could be measured, that beauty, intuition, and spiritual experience were forms of truth too. In Germany, Goethe wrote of the eternal conflict between intellect and passion, between the striving of the human spirit and the limits of knowledge. In England, Wordsworth found divinity not in churches, but in nature itself, streams, mountains, and the quiet stillness of dawn. In his eyes, the natural world was not machinery, it was sacred. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her, he wrote. It was as if the soul, long suppressed beneath centuries of doctrine, had finally exhaled. And yet, even in this rediscovery of wonder, there was a wound that would not heal. The God of certainty was gone, the God of feeling had taken his place. Faith had survived, but it had changed its face. For some, the new faith was not in the church, nor in reason, but in progress itself. Factories rose where cathedrals once dominated skylines. Steam engines roared where choirs once sang. Science promised not salvation in heaven, but improvement on earth. And in this new faith of invention and industry, humanity became both creator and creature of its own making. The Industrial Revolution was reason's grandest experiment, the transformation of knowledge into power. But with that power came alienation. The same machines that conquered nature began to consume the human spirit. Men and women, once guided by faith and community, now worked by the clock, their worth measured in productivity, not piety. The universe had become a mechanism, and now so had life itself. Still, religion did not die. It adapted. It modernized. Theologians and thinkers across Europe began to search for a synthesis, a way to reconcile the truths of science with the enduring need for meaning. In England, John Henry Newman argued that faith was not opposed to reason, but completed it. He saw the two not as enemies, but as partners. Reason discovering the mechanics of the world, faith giving it purpose. In his view, scientific truth revealed how creation unfolded. Revelation told us why it existed at all. Others took a more radical path. Friedrich Schleiermacher, a German theologian, declared that religion was not about doctrine or miracles, but about the feeling of absolute dependence, the recognition that behind all existence lies something infinite. Faith, he said, was not knowledge. It was experience. And in that definition, he rescued religion from the wreckage of reason by placing it in the heart, not the mind. These efforts were noble, even necessary, but they were also fragile, because science was still moving and moving fast. Every decade brought discoveries that seemed to push God further away. Geologists revealed that the Earth was far older than Genesis had ever imagined. Biologists began to suspect that life might not have appeared all at once, but gradually, evolving through time. The book of nature was being rewritten, and its author was becoming harder to find. Some believers clung to literal interpretations of Scripture, fearing that doubt would unravel everything. Others embraced science as a new form of divine revelation, arguing that God's wisdom could be found not only in holy texts, but in fossils, atoms, and stars. The tension was everywhere, in pulpits, in classrooms, in the minds of ordinary people trying to reconcile faith with fact. For the first time, faith itself became a choice rather than a certainty. In the past, belief had been inherited. Now it had to be reasoned or reimagined. Philosophers wrestled with this new reality. Immanuel Kant, one of the giants of Enlightenment thought, tried to define a boundary between science and faith. Reason, he argued, could explain phenomena, the world as we perceive it, but it could never reach the ultimate reality behind them. In that unknowable realm, faith still had its place. Thus, in a world dominated by logic, Kant carved out a small but sacred space for belief. It was a delicate truce, a fragile balance between knowledge and mystery. But even Kant knew it could not last forever. The thirst for understanding was too strong, the momentum of discovery unstoppable. Science was no longer confined to observation. It was now probing the origins of life itself. And with every fossil unearthed, every species classified, the story of creation began to look less miraculous and more mechanical. In this shifting landscape, one man's work would ignite a new storm. His theory would not only challenge faith, it would redefine humanity's very place in existence. The world was about to meet Charles Darwin. The telescope had shown that Earth was not the center of the universe. Darwin would show that humanity was not the center of creation. But before Darwin published a single word, the battle lines were already drawn. On one side stood those who believed that truth came from reason, evidence, and the natural world. On the other stood those who believed that truth was timeless, revealed by God, and beyond the reach of human logic. Between them stretched a centuries-old question, one that had changed form but never faded. Can faith and reason coexist, or must one destroy the other? As the 19th century unfolded, that question grew louder. Science and religion were no longer distant philosophies. They were rivals for the human soul. And though some tried to hold them together, the weight of discovery was pulling them apart. The fragile balance was tipping, and the fall would shake the world. In lecture halls, in churches, in newspapers, and private journals, people argued not just about theology, but about identity. If humanity was no longer God's special creation, what were we? If morality did not come from divine law, where did it come from at all? Could a purely rational world still be a moral one? Conclusion. A world forever changed. The Enlightenment began as a spark, a few thinkers daring to question what the world had always believed. But by the end of the 18th century, that spark had become a fire that reshaped civilization. Faith had ruled for millennia, its truths guarded by priests and kings. Now, reason stood beside it, bold, unyielding, demanding proof, not prayer. It was not just a shift in knowledge, it was a transformation of the human spirit. People no longer waited for revelation from above. They searched for understanding within themselves. The cosmos became a place of discovery, not mystery. The mind became its own sanctuary. And yet, for all its triumph, the Enlightenment left behind a haunting silence. In the glow of reason's light, many felt the shadow of something lost, an ache for meaning that no equation could solve, a longing for purpose that no philosophy could fill. Faith had been challenged, but not defeated. It had changed, becoming quieter, more personal, less about authority, more about the soul's private search. The world was forever altered. Kings fell, empires faded. But humanity remained, caught between two hungers, the need to know and the need to believe. And that tension, that fragile balance, would soon face its greatest test. A quiet naturalist, wandering the coasts of South America, would look at the simplest creatures and ask the most dangerous question of all: what if creation did not need a creator? Darwin's answer would ignite a new storm. Faith and reason would once again collide, this time not in philosophy, but in biology itself. The debate that began in the Enlightenment was far from over. It was only evolving. If you have made it this far, you have witnessed one of the most important turning points in human history, the moment when reason stood up to revelation. But the story doesn't end here. In the next episode, we follow Charles Darwin into the heart of the 19th century, where faith and science would face their most explosive confrontation yet. Was evolution the death of belief, or a new way to see creation? Let me know what you think. Do faith and reason truly oppose each other? Or are they two sides of the same search for truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Join the debate. And don't forget to subscribe to Logic Over Spirit to follow the next chapter in this 2,000-year journey between science and religion. The answers were uncertain, but the debate, the eternal dance between faith and reason, was alive as ever, reshaping every corner of thought, art, and society. And so, as the Enlightenment's light faded into the dawn of a new scientific age, humanity stood once more at a crossroads. It had escaped the prisons of ignorance, but also the comforts of certainty. It had gained the universe, but risked losing its soul. The balance, once so carefully held, began to tremble. And soon, a quiet English naturalist, wandering the shores of faraway islands, would tip it forever. The Enlightenment had given birth to reason's triumph, but in its victory lay the seed of its next great challenge. Faith had survived every storm before, but would it survive the theory that sought to explain creation itself?